Welcome, everybody. Kubernetes community meeting, October 12th. We're back to our regular schedule after last week's 1.8 update. As a warning, though, we may jump slightly out of order just because one of our Sig updates has a hard stop at 10:30. So I'll let you know if that's happening, depending on how things go. But we're going to start out with a demo of a relatively new project. It's not all that new, but relatively new project, certainly new to getting to full capabilities, which is KubeVirt. And Fabian Deutsch is going to give us that demo. So go ahead, Fabian.
Yes, sure. So hello, everybody, and let me start with sharing my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, that's working.
Cool. So, hello, my name is Fabian Deutsch, and I'm working at Red Hat, and I'm working on KubeVirt. So KubeVirt is a project which is about bringing virtualization to Kubernetes. We want to run virtualization workloads on Kubernetes. That means classical virtual machines, in that sense, like we know them from that era we are in today. And KubeVirt is about providing a virtualization API and a runtime for Kubernetes, for virtual machines. In a nutshell, we're providing that virtualization API using CRDs, and the operation pattern, our virtualization runtime stack is provided by KVM, or is intentionally limited to KVM, QEMU, libvirt on the node side. And the design goal is to provide KubeVirt as an add-on to Kubernetes, so that we provide everything you need in containers, like a daemon set, leveraging daemon sets, deployments, ingress, and whatever you need depending on the pod type. Because there are already a few projects with virtualization in the Kubernetes space, I just want to differentiate KubeVirt from the CRI approaches. So, for example, Virtlet, Fructi, or the OCICC runtime, they're effectively CRI approaches. So different CRI implementations, instead of running containers, they're running VMs and then eventually containers inside those VMs. The thing here is that those implementations are limited to the pod spec to express what kind of VM is getting created. You can do some modifications, like you can use annotations to provide some more additional details to the CRI runtime to a specific VM setup. But for KubeVirt, we went the other way, and we said we do the integration of virtualization workloads on the API level. So we decided to go with a dedicated API. We started off with PPRs, then moved to CRDs, and are currently working on a user API server so that we get a little bit more validation in a broader scope. And because some of the features we have, like virtual devices, for example, are just not there in pods, and we couldn't fit them into the pod model. Also, we have some functionality like live migrations, which are just not there in Kubernetes. I know it's been talked about to migrate pods, but we're not sure if that will ever come or not. But in the virtualization world, live migration is a critical feature. So we also provide an API for migration. Yeah, and so that's it on the details, on the theoretical details. So let's take a look how that looks in reality. All right, so we've got a demo, and you will find the links in the slide deck, and I'll add that to the minutes right after this demo. We've got a demo which is based on Minikube. So if you've got Minikube deployed, and I've got that on my system here, then you can run the demo as I've done it here above, and it will check for kubectl, it will check for Minikube, it will check out KubeVirt for you, and then it's deploying the manifests we provide. Then it's doing some checks until KubeVirt is really ready and deployed on your Minikube setup. It might take a while, that's why I prepared it, because our images are currently a little large because there's all the debug information in them. But once it is deployed, you can use KubeVirt. So the most intentional way to see if it's working is to say get VMs. And then you see that in this case, we've got a test VM deployed. before we dive into the VM, let's take a look how that is provided. So I said that we provide everything in pods. So let's take a look at the pods we actually provide. We've got the HA proxy. That is actually our workaround for the API server aggregation work. We've got a nice fuzzy demo target, which provides us the VM image we're booting. This is a nice fuzzy demo target, and we are able actually to use PVZs. And we're using it directly right now, but you could also use PVZs. There's the libvirt image to bring up the VM. We've got a Spice proxy to give users access from the outside of the cluster to the VMs running inside the cluster. We've got the virt API, which is doing the validation of the CRDs before they really are passed to Kubernetes. We've got a virt controller, which is effectively the operator operating on the CRDs we have. The virt handler, which is the node-sided component, speaking to the virt, so monitoring the CRDs and speaking to the virt to react to changes. And we've got the virt launcher. The virt launcher is actually that pod shell where the VM is running. And the virt manifest, you can ignore that for now. A quick look at the CRDs we provide. We currently have two, one for migrations and one for VMs. So let's get to the VMs again. So we've got a test VM, and you can, as it's the usual Kubernetes object, you can delete it. Before we create it, we can take a look how it actually looks. So I catted the VM YAML, and you see here we're using the Kubernetes API. You can put the usual stuff into the metadata sections. So we've got some support for selectors, and we are working on affinity and anti-affinity. But the interesting part is the spec. So here you see that we can really build a domain. So you've got a list of virtual devices, the graphics device, the network interface. You've got virtual disks. And here you see that this disk in this demo is using the iSCSI target I've shown before. And there's also a serial console. The machine is then using 64 megabytes of RAM. So let's create that again. So the VM got created. So let's take a look at the output. The status is interesting. Oh, it has already started. And you see here that the graphics console is now exported and that is running on the Minikube node. That's obvious. What you can do now is you can actually connect to that VM. And the most interesting part is that you can connect to the to the graphical console. So it's not really, like a kubectl exec or attached, but it's really a graphical console. We're using the Spice protocol. I think that's the wrong way around. And here we are. So that is really the graphical console of the VM currently running. It's an Alpine Linux image because my machine is not beefy enough to run anything larger at the moment. So that's the interesting bit from the runtime side on a single node. One additional interesting thing I want to highlight is actually that what I mentioned, we've got migration API. So Minikube, as you've seen on this shell, has a single node. But I've also prepared our developer setup, which is based on Vagrant, which I'm now showing. And we've got two nodes running there, so master node and the single worker node. And we also got a VM running here. It's a test VM again. And what we can do now is we can take a look where that VM is running. And you see it's currently running on the master. Once you can do migration, once you do migration, it will land on a different node. So create -f cluster, we've prepared a YAML file to do the migration. That migration was created. We can take a look, actually, get migration. Oh yeah, it's a typo. So there we go. There the migration is, get migration. Just let's take a brief look. Oh, it failed. That's actually sad. Let's take a look. It really failed. Let's take a look at the node of the VM. It's still on the master. So let's retry that. And let's take a look if it's going to change. So that's it with demos. They sometimes fail. Let's take a look at the second. It failed. So sad. So sad that it failed. I won't debug the reason for now. The important bit here is that we've got that API to do it. Actually, as we've got 1 minute, I will actually try it. Okay, delete minus test. So what I'm doing is I'm recreating the VM. Maybe there's something wrong with that VM. What I'm doing now, I'm just trying to rerun the migration. Actually, before I do that, let's check on what node it's running. Okay, it's running on node 0, and let's give the migration a last try, last chance. Oh, and that's good. It's running now. Perfect. It succeeded now. Lucky I am. And then now it's running on the master. So it was scheduled initially on node 0, and now it's running on the master. So that worked. Yeah, that's all I wanted to show. So I want to give you a brief overview over the VM API, how that is looking. We looked at the Vagrant setup, that it's just a quick glance at the future. We're working on making it even easier to be deployable on every Kubernetes cluster. One piece of that is working on API of aggregation to get rid of our workarounds. We want to do pod networking properly to connect up on the networking side. And if in the physical and the real life, we'll have a virtualized workload saloon at KubeCon North America with all the other virtualization-related projects of Vertlet from Mirantis, Hyper, and Intel to talk about all the virtualization-related aspects. And here's actually my request for this forum. We really take this serious, and we would like to have a forum to discuss all these virtualization-related matters. There's a lot of stuff in the scheduling area, in the network area, in the storage area, on the node level, and we don't find a fitting Zig or work group where we can attach to. So what I would really like to ask is there a chance to get a virtualization Zig or working group, and to which Zig should we be attached? And does it make sense, on the other hand, to say that as we're working on virtualization API, which is interesting eventually to other users as well, if this could be an incubator project? So I'm unsure on both points. That is why I wanted to raise these two questions. And I would really actually like to see if we can make some progress there, because those questions have been hanging around for quite a while. Okay, thank you very much. And are there any questions?
So first of all, thank you, Fabian, for demoing this. This is super cool. I built out Compute Engine on top of Borg at Google, and there are lots of echoes here. It's kind of, it's fascinating to watch this stuff get sort of independently created on top of Kubernetes. One thing that I think is interesting, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is the difference between running a VM in a pod, which is essentially what you're doing, which the VM is the first class thing that the user gets delivered to them, versus running a pod in a VM, which is using a VM as virtualization technology for running the pod as an isolation mechanism, right? And they're both involve virtualization, but it seems like there's really, those are two very different scenarios in terms of what the experience is to the end user.
Yeah, yes, I agree. The experience really is different, and it's a reappearing question. So my take is, I think we'll continue to see both. So we need that, that transparent use of VMs in the isolation use case, and we will need that explicit use for if you want to run VMs. And I think we should have that room to discuss if there are points of alignment, because we run the VM in a pod, and that has benefits. It actually, I think it has strong benefits because it makes Kubernetes staying nice, because you just need to take care about pods and don't consider specific hypervisors if that is ever needed. But if we want to consider that route, then it makes sense to find points of alignment between both use cases. there are opportunities, but it's also not that easy. So we actually looked at having something similar like a CRI when we started, but yeah, I think one big problem there is that whenever you are on the pod level, so CRI level, you're working with container assumptions. So the CRI is built and pods are built around the core assumptions of containers being status and so on and so forth. And our API is built around the assumptions you have on virtual machines.
Unfortunately, at this point, we need to move on to the rest of the agenda. So
I wanted to just, sorry, real quick. I think actually multi-tenancy is a good SIG. I wanted to address a quick comment about non-tenancy. Yeah. I would encourage folks to work on, and this is kind of to Joe's point. So, there's a lot of, I think, going to be a lot of crossover between multi-tenancy work and this work, and I think as people, if you're looking for people to work with, that would be a good place to start.
Great,
also,
thank you for that feedback.
Also, this is Mike Rubin from Google. David Oppenheimer is doing a lot of work on this with Clayton Coleman right now, and so he's exploring both scheduling and security and multi-tenancy and namespace work. So if anyone is interested in these areas, I'm not quite sure if this is a SIG thing or a work group piece, but I know.
So we're thinking of starting.
Thanks, David.
Yeah. So a fellow from Huawei, whose name escapes me, I sincerely apologize, has also someone who Quentin referred me to, is also interested in starting some kind of multi-tenancy working group. And so we have started discussing that, and we'll have news on that soon. So we expect there will be a working group under the auspices of Sig Auth, most likely, sometime in the near future.
David, can you commit to maybe presenting what's going on with that in a community meeting sometime by the end of the year or before KubeCon?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yes, definitely.
That sounds great, because it seems like there's just so many folks across the community who are interested in this, and it actually showed up in the storage face-to-face a little bit also this week. So, having a lighthouse for all of us to, sail towards would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. We're just starting to talk about the details, and we'll make a proposal to the community soon.
Sounds wonderful.
Okay, thanks everybody. And speaking of David Oppenheimer, we're actually going to jump out of order on the agenda because of schedule conflict that David has. And we're going to take the Cig scheduling update before the release updates. So do you want to go ahead, David?
Yeah, sure. And I think Tim St. Clair, Tim, are you also here? We're going to do this, I think, together, or I don't know. I'll start, and hopefully Tim is online. So I'll just go real fast, briefly with our 1.9 plans for Cig scheduling. One of them is reducing open bugs and stability. That's a key thing. We noticed that there's a large number of open issues that are not don't appear to be super dangerous, but are kind of why is this happening kinds of things that we need to dig into, and we've been putting off. So reducing open bugs is high on the list for 1.9. Bobby has been working on priority and preemption. It was alpha in 1.8. It will stay alpha in 1.9. There are some issues, some known issues with it that he had been planning to address, which he will address. But given the short release cycle for 1.9, we want to keep that in alpha. Again, we'll put in the meeting notes exactly the issues that he's going to be working on. But they do include making it easier to debug priority and preemption problems that people have in production. That's one of the key things that is going to be going into that work, such as knowing why a pod is pending and not preempting when you think it should be preempting, and also being able to know what preemptions will happen if you submit some replica set or job or whatever. So some kind of dry run mode. And there is already some rudimentary support for both of these in Kubernetes, but the idea is to improve the user experience for those and make sure that people can use it easily when they're using these features, so that they don't get surprised by preemptions, because this is a fairly disruptive new feature once people start using priority. Of course, if you don't use priority, then nothing will happen and there's no change of behavior, but people who do use it we don't want them to get surprised by what happens. So so he's going to be working on that, and also trying to find some real users to try out the feature at scale. And then another part, the last piece of that, besides fixing some of these open issues with it, is adding priority to resource quota. I've noticed actually there's a lot of work going on in resource quota in parallel. I hope folks are coordinating to some extent. It seems like there's at least 3 or 4 different teams that are all adding new resources to resource quota. The priority work isn't actually adding a new resource, it's basically adding another dimension to resource quota so that the quotas are by namespace and by priority, by kind of essentially the cross product of the two. And there's an open PR proposal from the community on how to do that, from RESOUR, one of the folks in the Cig Scheduling community, on how to add priority to resource quota. So it shouldn't interfere with the work that's going on to add new resources to resource quota, but it's worth being aware of. And then quickly, just a few other things in 1.9. One of the issues that has been hanging around for quite a while is whether to move daemon set scheduling to the scheduler. So since the beginning of Kubernetes, daemon sets have always been scheduled by the daemon set controller, and this has some benefits, but it's also caused a number of problems over time. You have to keep the logic in sync with the default scheduler logic, and then when it gets out of sync, weird bugs happen. It's also bad in general to have 2 copies of the code, and we never really tried to turn anything into a library and reuse it. So we kind of just have 2 totally different implementations of the scheduling logic. On the other hand, there are some downsides of trying to use the default scheduler to schedule daemon sets, even though it sounds like a great solution at first, and I was very excited about it. So there's an open issue. If people want to see what's going on there, it's 42002, and we'll put it in the meeting notes. But this will probably have to involve Sig architecture as well, because there's a lot of trade-offs here in whether to continue having daemon sets be scheduled by the daemon set controller or move that to just be scheduled as regular pods by the default scheduler. So we want to get that resolved and implemented if we're going to do it during 1.9. Lastly, just a couple of minor things. There's going to be continuing work on the descheduler, which is the new name for the rescheduler that shouldn't have been called the rescheduler in the first place. This is in Kubernetes incubator. This is the thing that you can think of as moving pods around to meet policies like spreading out pods when they're on overly utilized nodes and things like that. Like, for example, after a zone failure, the zone comes back up, the zone's empty, you want to move some of the already running pods onto those nodes that are in the recovered zone. Otherwise, that zone just stays empty for a long time. It does things like that. And Avesh from Red Hat has been working on it, and some other people as well, and it's in an incubator, and there will be continued work on that. It's not tied to the Kubernetes release cycle itself. Yeah, the rest of the things, I don't know if it's worth going into in the Tim, do you think any of those remaining issues are worth talking about? You're welcome to go ahead and talk about those if you want to.
We can just put notes in the meeting notes. I think the one thing I wanted to spell out too was with regards to priority and preemption. I forgot the name of the original implementation for infrastructure pods that we wanted to never be preempted, but that original implementation will probably be deprecated in favor of priority and preemption going forwards at some point in time.
Yes. Yeah, the critical pod annotation thing, like Tim said, will be deprecated once this, presumably once priority and preemption goes to beta, which is when it will be enabled by default, and then we can get rid of the critical pod annotation and the associated logic, which we were unfortunately calling a rescheduler. That can all go away.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have more in the notes, and if you have questions for them, please do it in the chat. I think for the sake of the stream, we will finish up the Sig updates and then go back to the release updates. First I want to see Aaron Krickenberger is not on the call, or a representative from Sig testing, just to confirm. Okay, we'll have to defer that to a future call. So let's go ahead and take the update from Sig Docs. So it should be Andrew, Chen, and Zach.
Zach, you want to go first?
Absolutely. So hello, my name is Zach Corlison. I'm logged in as Kubernetes Sig Docs lead, so I guess that's what I look like right now. Andrew, Chen, and I will be splitting the Sig update for Docs today. Andrew's going to talk a little bit about some of the specific things that we're doing with user journeys and some of the more repo-specific projects and developer happiness projects that we're working on. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've been in terms of the 1.8 release, where we're going with the 1.9 release, and also about our Chinese translation milestone. So let me pull up my notes. All right, so for docs for the 1.8 release, docs for the 1.8 release are a thing that happened, yay. Many thanks again to Steve Perry for serving as Docsmeister for 1.8. We're working on incorporating feedback from the 1.8 retrospective. Specifically, I'm communicating deadlines effectively and clearly. That was one of the big pieces of feedback, was that deadlines seemed fuzzy for docs. And so we definitely like to make that clearer for 1.9. 1.9 is coming up. I'm the Docsmeister for 1.9, and I'd really love to communicate deadlines clearly and effectively. So that's something that will get a lot of focus. Talking about our Chinese translation milestone. So Sig Docs had our first sync meeting with the Chinese translation team. That meeting went very well, and over the course of it, some things became apparent. Internationalization requires feature implementation at different layers of the doc stack. It requires feature implementation at the authoring layer. Where do we store translated files, for example? That's a question about how specifically we do that. It requires feature implementation at the deployment level. How do we push and how do we deploy and push translation updates? And it also requires feature implementation at the presentation layer. That means, functionally, that means implementing a language selector. Internationalization also requires unique Sig workflows for Sig Docs. The specific question that we're wrestling with there is who approves PRs for Chinese translations when no one with approval permission speaks Chinese? So we have figured some workarounds for this, and I'll get to the specifics here in a minute. Another thing that became apparent over the course of this meeting was that no one in Sig Docs maintainers has ever done an open source internationalization before. So we're all kind of operating in the dark. So with these things in mind, with these discoveries, we are setting up some best practices for translating Kubernetes docs, not just for Chinese, but for other translations in the future. So we are putting together, I think one of the first things is to acknowledge that because none of us have ever really done this before, there's a lot of room to do things either accidentally well or accidentally quite wrong. So we're putting together a Q&A with internationalization contributors from OpenStack who worked on the OpenStack translation project so that we can learn from their process and avoid reinventing how to translate the wheel, if you will. And we're working on migrating internationalization content from the Chinese team's external translation workflows into GitHub. And what that means is that the Chinese translation team so far has been doing their own thing in spreadsheets and in docs that aren't visible to the Kate's org or to the Sig Docs workflow. So we're working to bring the Chinese translation team into the Kubernetes org and to bring their translation workflow and their translation materials into the repo. So we've also added some members of the Chinese translation team as collaborators for the docs repo to help with PR approval and to make sure that somebody who is able to understand and give a thumbs up, a thumbs down meaningfully to Chinese language PRs is participating in the workflow. So the TLDR for Chinese translation for internationalization is that it is a lot of work, but it's awesome. Other Sig updates, at the last Sig Docs meeting earlier this week, we considered and decided to approve renaming the docs repo. And we're going to be going from Kubernetes/kubernetes.github.io to Kubernetes/website. And Andrew Chen is going to be the one who implements that cutover. And I think, Andrew, am I remembering correctly that we're going to do that in a month?
Yeah. So we have a intermediate meeting like in a couple of weeks to make sure everything is in place. And then the cutover is planned for, I think, the beginning of November, right? The 6th?
Yes. Excellent. Other good news, our queue for open PRs in the docs repo is now below 40. We have fewer than 40 open PRs in docs. That is largely due to the work of Steve Perry, who got something flipped inside of him, and he has decided that PRs are the enemy, and has decided to close all of them in a high quality way, and there will be no more PRs ever for docs. And I think it's wonderful, and it has made our workflow much more manageable. So many thanks to Steve Perry. So a little bit of crystal ball gazing. It would be awesome to bring the Kubernetes blog into the workflow for the rest of the website. Currently, the blog is the only piece of content that doesn't reside inside of the actual documentation repo. We'd like to change that. The work involved is not trivial, but it's also not unreasonable. So if anyone is looking to contribute to the docs, to Sig Docs, and if you have experience migrating content from Blogger to Markdown, or experience with CSS and page layouts, and if you'd like to contribute, please contact me. Boy, do we have a project for you. And that's it from my side. Andrew, you want to talk about user journeys and
Glossary stuff? Yeah. So we're just about to put out Glossary, which is it's a pretty cool framework that Jessica Yao from Heptio did really great work on. So the idea is like we can have like these terminology snippets in a directory, and then we have a page that auto generates like the glossary. That way we can reuse the terminology throughout the site, and it's sort of like dynamic. So I put a preview link in the notes if you want to take a look. But so I don't want to take up too much time here. So then we're also, the other big project going on is user journeys. So we're in the process of like finishing sort of hashing out the design and content for like the app developer. And then we have a few more that we're going to do that we're going to put out as part of the MVP. And let's see, with Paris's help, we also sent out a community survey that has a couple of questions about like, you know, which kind of roles and personas that people see themselves as and which ones they think are the most important. That should help us prioritize which ones that we implement. And then we're going to try to fold in a couple of the other ones like code contributors and platform developers. But that's a little bit further down the line. Let's see. And then Steve Perry is taking ownership of the auto-generated docs, which is awesome. So and from that, we're going to be able to clean up a bunch of the links that are in there. And once that's done, he and I are going to kick off an SEO audit to follow up, because we had one before, like last year, and so we want another one now that we're done with the move to Netlify, and kind of benchmark to see if our SEO has improved since doing that. Yeah, and then I've been talking with Tim Hawking, and we're planning to rename the Kubernetes.github.io repo, which is kind of awkwardly named, to something more simple like Kubernetes/website. And I cleared that through Sig Docs already. So we're just going to plan a cutover date. And that, I think, is all. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that update in Sig Docs and all the work to get our documentation into shape. And yay! And yay, no PRs. Well, in the future. So now we're going to actually go back to the release updates. And we are going to start with our new 1.9 release lead, which is Anthony. So Anthony, you want to give us an update on where we are with 1.9?
Hello, this is Anthony. So we're looking to get started next week on the 1.9 release team activities. We do have a couple of roles though that are not filled yet, including the secondary release lead and test signal and some important roles there. So please go, there's a link to a spreadsheet in the meeting notes. Click on that and you can just put your name in the list and I'll be trying to get in touch with you next week. Thank you to everyone, including Zach, who's already volunteered to help out with the release. Next thing is just want to point out the tentative release schedule. Already we have coming up in a couple of weeks, the feature freeze on October 27th. So we're going to be asking you to tell us all your plans and keep in mind that code freeze is only less than a month after that. So, you know, keep that in mind when you're deciding what you're going to try to commit to. And the reason it's because this quarter is going to be a short one with the holidays. We're targeting December 13th, middle of the month for the final release date. And then lastly, an early warning to Sig Storage and Sig Network. Please go and look at the release blocking test. There's also a link in the notes. There's a number of tests there that are failing and we are going to be coming after you.
Okay, that was fast. So, 1.8, Chase?
Yeah, so 1.8.1 went out last night, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Joe Betts, who did the work on that. Thank you. And also to Anthony, who helped with a little bit of cleanup this morning from the Anago problem that they had during that for tagging the release. So that should be, I think, all fixed up now. And I wanted to do a quick public service announcement about cherry picks because there's a lot of questions about how best to do that. And actually, there's a great doc that exists, and it's linked in the notes. It explains the process and how that gets done, and that will also help Joe be more effective in getting the cherry picks done if you follow the process and use the cherry pick tool. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out to people who didn't know it was there. So I think we're all good on 1.8.1, and hopefully that'll get some good use out there. So that's all I have.
Okay, thanks. It was really speedy. And per the notes, we don't have any updates for 1.7, apparently. So that means we're actually on to announcements. George? Okay, and then Contributor Summit. So Ihor and Paris.
All right. So just a quick note, that is formerly called Dev Summit. We are going to be renaming it to Contributor Summit as it best matches with several initiatives going on, including what you just heard from Andrew with personas. Developer indicates to a lot of folks that they are building on top of the API. So your rightful name should be upstream contributors. So we are naming this to Contributor Summit. The date and venue has been confirmed, Tuesday, December 5th, right before KubeCon, and the invites and lottery will be sent out as soon as possible. So expect that within the next 24 hours to early next week at the very latest. And also, yeah, one more thing to note too. We do kind of realize that we're growing out of this format. There's so many contributors, hundreds already. So we realize that we want to be inclusive as possible to all contributors. So next year we are looking into ideas of making this either a different format or scaling this out to be something even different. So more soon on that as well.
Well, thank you. We're actually finishing up early here. So is there anything not in the agenda that's urgent for this week, or do we give people a coffee break before their next meeting? Anyone?
I'll take the coffee.
Okay. Okay, so everybody here now gets a 19-minute coffee break before whatever your next meeting is. And thank you very much for everybody who participated.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.